'Twas a few days past Christmas, and this film was late, for the other creators all had the right date. The footage was shot and the doll was all dressed, but I was still editing, 'cause I'm a hot mess. I knew in my heart that this task would be quick, so I wanted a doll that would please old Saint Nick. But I misjudged my time, as I am wont to do, and this project took 4 weeks instead of just 2. I worked and I toiled long into the night to make sure I could get every detail just right. But Christmas drew nearer and I had no choice, so I screamed at my tools at the top of my voice. Damned printer, damned scissors, damned resin and glue, damned thread! Come on, fabric, I'm pleading with you! But despite all my troubles, an elf did appear, with a round button nose and 2 cute pointed ears. He looks straight from the workshop, though I made him myself, and I'm bursting with glee for this cute little elf. Though Christmas is over, just try to remember, I posted this before the end of December. I purchased this Fenjia Xian doll from my friend Logan Dolls. It was originally a blind box doll that had 5 other siblings that all had the same body, but different facial expressions and ears. After I received him, I fell in love with his chubby little body and his large pointed ears. I was originally going to customize him for Halloween as a mini Dracula, but that didn't happen. But when I started looking for a Christmas project, I thought he would look like a perfect elf from the North Pole. As you just saw, I separated his head from his body and placed it on a pike. Then to protect his skin, I covered him with cellophane, then wrapped his head in a stretchy netting material and secured it tightly around his neck with rubber bands. Because his ears stick out so far from his head, I used additional rubber bands to pull the fabric down so there wasn't going to be any gap in the netting. Then for the first layer, I used Mod Podge, mostly because I didn't have any other white glue. I waited a few hours for that to dry and then added a layer of white glue because my dutiful wife ran to the store for me. Then I waited a few hours and put on one last layer, then let it sit overnight. I knew I wanted to make this little guy a redhead, but the only suitable colored yarn at the store was this chonky boy. So, expect more redheaded dolls in my future. I wrapped the yarn around my ruler and cut it at one end. This quickly gives me several strands of evenly cut yarn. Then I tied the strands to some pencils and manually unraveled each one. Next, I brush it out with my dog slicker brush until it's super fuzzy. Then I make it silky smooth and shiny with my flat iron. Back to my fully dry scalp, I mark where I think the hairline should be. Then remove the scalp off of his head. Next, I cut out along the hairline marks I made before. Then I fit it back on his head with some new cellophane. To apply my new yarn wefts, I apply a tiny amount of glue to the scalp and stick the weft on. Then with a silicone tool, I add a little bit more glue on top to catch the pieces that didn't get caught in the original glue. I work from the bottom of the hairline up to my part lines. For my part lines, I make longer strips of wefts by applying the yarn pieces to parchment paper instead of the head. Then when that dries, I cut off any extra glue and fold the end over some cardstock and gently iron to create a crease. Because I wanted to give this doll a short haircut, I actually created the part line in a semicircle on top of the scalp. Then I glued these creased wefts to either side of the part. Then, with my X-Acto knife, I gently cut along the semicircle and flip the scalp inside out. Then apply wefts to the inside of the scalp on both sides of the cut, and feed the remaining hair up through the outside. To close the gap, I glue a small piece of the netting all around the semicircle and let it dry. Then fill the top of the scalp with my remaining wefts and make sure that they were all applied so the hair would lay toward the front of his face and to the right. I chose to begin cutting his hair with trimmers and then finished by texturizing with my thinning shears. Now, I've never used trimmers or cut a wig this short, so it was, let's say, interesting. As much as the robe à la Francais gown was a nightmare to make, it also taught me a lot about how to pattern for dolls and sewing in general. Now, I'm not stating that I'm any good at any of this, but at least I can say that I'm improving. After taking way too many measurements, I began to draft a basic bodice pattern. I'm drafting this pattern along the center front fold, with the doll's chest, waist, and hip measurements marked along that line. Those measurements help me figure out the placement of his neck and sleeves. Then I used the sleeve hole as a template for the sleeve pattern. For the fabric, I picked out this oatmeal-colored rib knit material. It seems sort of warm and Christmassy to me. Since this little elf is a craftsman, I decided to make his shirt a Henley, you know, the kind with a little button closure on the front. Don't ask me why. I guess I've watched too many of those Hallmark Christmas movies. You know, the guys always seem to be wearing those in them. However, I did make some bias tape out of some red fabric to help decorate the button section of the shirt. Then I cut out the sleeves. And folded some strips of the oatmeal fabric to work as cuffs, the waistband, and the collar. I begin by sewing the decorative trim to each side of the shirt opening. Then I overlap the bottom of the opening and stitch across to keep the opening closer together. Next, I place my back pieces on top of my front piece, right sides together, and sew them along the shoulder seam. Then I sew along my side seams. With one of the strips of trim fabric, I unfold it and sew along the right side of the shirt and then fold it over and stitch it to the wrong side to cover the raw edges of the back. I repeat this step for the waistband and for the sleeve cuff. With the sleeve, I fold it over lengthwise and sew along the edge. Then line up the sleeve hole in the bodice with the top of the sleeve and hand sew them together with a back stitch. Then apply the collar. I really wanted to make real buttonholes for the neck closure, but the fabric was too thick for me to try. So I simply sewed on some bright gold buttons. There's a creator on Instagram named Jelly Blythe who shares free doll patterns. So I borrowed a few of their designs and adapted it for this little guy. Because I want to make the doll look even more short and bottom heavy, I made the overalls super baggy and dropped the crotch seam down. Okay, so it's time for my usual "I've never done this before" part of the project. I've decided that I want to learn hand embroidery in the new year, but I was a little too anxious to wait. So I designed a snowflake embroidery pattern and transferred it to some tissue paper. Now I know that people normally transfer it directly to the fabric, but this fabric was so dark that I couldn't see my blue pen markings. Then, with a fresh cuppa, I embroidered the snowflake using a combination of a fly stitch and backstitch. When I finished, I painstakingly had to pull off all of the tissue paper. Ah yes, the main fabric. When I started this project, I knew I didn't want to make him look like the corny elves we all see during this time of year. But I still wanted him to look Christmassy. So I chose these two muted red and green woven fabrics. They both feel rustic and fairly practical to me. I chose the green for the outer fabric and the red for the inner. I changed Jelly Blythe's design slightly to allow for pockets along the front waistband, and chose this shiny white fabric for the lining. Then on the front piece, I cut slits where the darts should be. Over at my sewing machine, I begin by sewing the edge of the pocket lining to the front side of the overalls. Then top stitch to make it lay down more easily. Then I do the same with the opposite side of the pocket opening. Next, I lay both linings together, right sides facing in, and sew up and around to close the pocket. For the inner piece, I simply fold and sew the dart as intended. Then I place both pieces together, right sides facing in, and baste a few times up the center to lock the fabric in place. Next, I sew along the top edge of the overalls and along the leg hem with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I remove the basting stitches and turn the fabric right side out. For the outer edges and down the leg, I run a zigzag stitch as a faux overlocking stitch. Then top stitch along the top and fold over and close the back seam. Then fold the overalls the other direction and sew up one pant leg, through the crotch, and down the other leg. Pretty cute, huh? With more bias tape, I sew down the long open edge to make a strap. Then fold over and stitch one end. I made sure to leave a loop so I could feed in one of these tiny hooks I bought from AliExpress. Then I sewed the strap to the back of the overalls. My embroidery turned out kinda wonky, but I'm pretty pleased with it for a first attempt. I made myself a pocket template with the seam allowance included so I could line up my pocket design. Then I folded over and steam ironed the edges to create my perfect pocket shape. Then I appliqued the pockets onto the fabric using an invisible stitch. Because I suck at stuff like this, I asked my wife to poke holes in the front of the overalls and install the buttons for the hooks to attach to. I have heard that it is very cold at the North Pole, and these overalls are pretty baggy, so I thought it was necessary to make this guy some boxer shorts. I chose red cotton for them and made sure to wash the fabric really, really well, as red likes to stain doll skin. And since cotton likes to fray, I ran fray check along the edges. I first sewed along the outer seams of the shorts, and then folded over and hemmed the bottom of the legs. Then sewed up the back seam to attach both sides together. Using bias tape, I made a peepee opening in the front and a waistband. Then fed elastic through the waistband and secured the ends. Using another Jelly Blythe pattern as inspiration, I designed a hat pattern. I found this faux suede and lamb's fur fabric at the store and discovered that they both separated fairly easily. So I figured I could use the side with the removed fluff for the outer part of the hat and the fluff side for the interior. I start by sewing together the petal pieces for the exterior layer of the hat. Then do the same with the interior pieces. For the brim, I sew a piece of the lining to a piece of the outer. Then turn it right side out and top stitch the edge. Then attach it to the outer part of the hat. Then fit the outer piece inside the lining and stitch around the edge. However, the hat looked awful. So I yeeted that thing and made another without the fluffy lining. I recently was gifted a bunch of antique beads and chose one to become the ball at the top of the hat. I begin by spraying his face with a few coats of Mr. Super Clear UV Cut Flat. Then with some chalk pastels, I add some yellow to his forehead, blue to his chin, and pink to his cheeks. Then I bring out my precious watercolor pencils and begin to add some pink around his eyes, including his lacrimal caruncle. On top of that, I add a little bit of white to his waterline. Then add some more pink and orange to his cheeks. Psst, I have something to confess. I haven't figured out how to create the perfect eyelash yet. I mean, I'm still working on it, but it's really tough to get it just right. But I think using some watered-down acrylic helped a lot. Next, I drew on his eyebrows with different shades of watercolor pencils and added some line detail to his lips. Since he's a redhead, he needs freckles. So I thinned some paint and dabbed it on with a toothpick, then blotted off the excess. I feel like this gives the most accurate freckle look. I perked up the shine on his waterline with a little bit of thinned off-white paint. And added a little to his eyelashes too. Then with gloss varnish, I glossed his waterline and lips. A little redhead needs vibrant green eyes. Plus, red and green are the colors of the season, right? So my wife 3D printed me some eye bases. Then with metallic paints, I applied a base coat of green with a little bit of gold in the center and darker green along the outer edge. I like to lightly sand along the rim of the eye to clean up any places where I didn't color inside the lines properly. Next, my wife added some black UV resin to the pupil. Then she filled the center with clear UV resin and cured it, then added some resin to the top to create a dome. After all of that was fully cured, we dipped the eyes into clear resin to give the eyes a dewy look. Then give it a final cure under the UV lamp. Ooh, shiny. This dude needs some footwear. To make a pattern for socks, I used the tried and true cellophane and painter's tape method. This is pretty easy because there's really only one seam. Okay, at the sewing machine, I fold over the top and stitch it down. Then I sew along the back seam and voila, he has socks. His shoes, on the other hand, are an entirely different story. My wife designed and 3D printed some soles and toe boxes, and some mannequin feet so I wouldn't mess up his skin. I decided that I wanted him to have some festive work/hiking boots. So after analyzing the seam lines of the boots, I designed a pattern. I liked the suede fabric from before, but I needed it to be thicker, so I doubled it up using spray adhesive. I began sewing by folding over the eye stay and top stitching it. The suede doesn't like to sew easily, so I used some tissue paper underneath. Next, I attached the quarter of the shoe to my ton and vamp piece. Then I top stitch on both sides of the seam to give it a more realistic look. Once I've done that on both sides, I fold it over and sew up the back. And top stitch again. Finally, I stitch the collar of the shoe to both sides and then flip it inside out and stitch around the heel. Then with my glue, I begin to fold the extra fabric around the inner sole. Next, I attach some fabric glue to my heel counterpiece and attach it to the heel. Oh my gosh, check out the adorable snowflakes May put on the bottom of the soles. The next step is to glue the bottom soles onto the bottom of the inner sole. Again, because I suck at this sort of thing, I have my wife install eyelets to the eye stays on either side of the throat. Then I grab some brown cording and lace up the boots. Again, May designed and 3D printed some tools for me. After prepping the pieces, I painted the metal parts bronze with my bronze gilding paint. For the handles, however, I wanted these to look like aged wood, so I started by painting a cream base coat. Then I dry brushed on a medium and a dark brown, then finished it with black. Back to the metallic pieces, I watered down some black and painted it on, then dabbed it off with a paper towel, and glued a tiny wire to my jewelry saw. May 3D printed some base rings for me, and just like the tools, I prepped them and coated them with bronze paint. And also gave them a black wash. This helps the pieces look older and well used. But on the goggles, I ran a silver Sharpie along most of the corners and edges to help them sparkle a little bit, but also to look like worn metal. Next, I cut some pieces out of thin fake leather for around the eyes and to use as straps. I wrapped the entire piece around and glued the ends together. Just as I was about to hand cut some plexiglass for these lenses, this beauty arrived. More on her later. As for the straps, I wrapped one end through a buckle and glued it in place. On the other end, I punched holes with an awl. With another strap, I folded over and nicked one end so the strap could fit over the center of this buckle. Then I glued the tail to the back side of the strap. This allows for the buckle to still move and function. And I attached a circular buckle to the other end. Next, I glued the circular buckles to the outside edge of the goggles. May then joined me and cut a ball chain to size and inserted it to the inside edges of the goggles. Then she secured them in place with UV resin. To give the goggles that Coke bottle look, she poured resin inside and cured it. First, I inserted his eyes, then secured his head back onto his body, and replaced his backplate. Next, I pulled on his cozy shirt. Then I slipped on his boxers, pulled on his overalls, slid his socks on, and added a tiny bit of museum putty to the top of his head to help secure his wig. Then I placed his little hat. If you're new here and liked this project, please subscribe and turn on notifications. I'm a tiny creator, so every subscription, bell ringing, like, share, and comment helps my channel grow and keeps me excited to continue sharing my process with you all. Plus, I really love commenting with you all afterwards. It's truly my favorite part. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you had a sweet time.